Assalamu alaikum, بینندگان عزیز تلویزیون طالع.
Good evening and welcome to Pole. The Washington, D.C. premiere of The Great Game has brought together people from all walks of life, from musicians and artists to actors and policymakers, to discuss the history and culture of Afghanistan. Tonight, I'm at the Shakespeare Theatre to speak with the performers and director of The Great Game, a series of plays examining British, Soviet, and American involvement over the past 200 years of Afghan history. The Great Game opened in London last year and has now traveled to the United States, where it will play in 4 cities, including Washington, D.C.
Nicholas, I want to thank you for participating in our program today. You are the creator who brought this whole Great Game project together. Can you tell our audience what is this Great Game cycle of plays and in what moments of Afghan history are you covering?
Well, I was very aware in 2008 that the world's attention was very much more on Iraq than Afghanistan, and I wanted to know more about Afghan history. So we took, obviously, the 3 British wars, the drawing of the Durand Line. We took Amanullah, being fleeing the country when he was overthrown by the tribal chieftains. We took the Russian invasion. We took the arming of the Mujahideen by the CIA, the coming of the Taliban, Massoud and his fight against the Taliban and eventually his assassination, and then Operation Enduring Freedom and the ISAF forces in Afghanistan.
But how did you come up with this concept of covering, over, let's say, 150 years of history, and which moments within that history that you would focus upon?
Well, for obvious reasons, because it's a series of plays, I was looking for the most dramatic moments of Afghan history. I didn't want to go back before 1842, because it would be very difficult for English playwrights or American playwrights to write Afghan history. That's something that Afghan poets, Afghan musicians, and the Afghan imams and people know a lot about, and the population know about. I wanted to do things about the Western intervention since 1842.
Because your audience would be those in London and perhaps in the US.
And some Afghan people who'd actually left Afghanistan, maybe during the communist regime when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, that sort of audience, yes. I wanted to inform a Western audience more about Afghanistan.
We Afghans always make the same mistake.
What mistake?
Jesus
Christ! Jesus!
What?
Nothing.
What's wrong?
You seem so calm, the ground shook.
You've never been under fire before, have you?
No.
Don't worry about the bombs you can hear. If you heard the bomb, it hasn't killed you. The bombs to be afraid of are the ones you don't hear.
And I understand that you brought together basically a team of about 12 playwrights to write different pieces of this play. How did that work?
Well, I got a whole number of playwrights, many of whom are very established, some of whom less established. I asked them which bits of Afghan history they would like to take, and some of whom I just said, why don't you do this particular piece of Afghan history? I researched a lot myself. I went to Kabul. I met a lot of Afghans. I met a lot of people who were acquainted with the history and knew a lot about the history. And I tried with the writers to get each of them to do a subject that would tell this story over 12 plays.
And you talk about, the changing perceptions of people once they get more information about the culture. Do you think a play like The Great Game can have an impact on that?
Yes, enormously. It starts to make people look at Afghans as individuals. It starts to make them realize that they are suffering terrible casualties in this war, that they've been through a civil war which has gone on for years and years, and it looks at Afghans, the ordinary Afghans, as people who have families, who have children, who have hearts, who have souls, and who we should care about deeply.
And in that, did you have Afghans who tried out for roles in the play? And if not, was it difficult to try to find Afghan actors or actresses?
Well, there are no Afghan actors in England who speak fluent English that I know of, but we have quite a few with a Pakistan heritage or an Indian heritage who've been cast in these plays.
There is a scene I want to go to of the Taliban confronting an artist who's painting a mural in Herat. And that mural depicts some of the heroes of Afghanistan, but then it's whitewashed.
Yeah, there was an actual mural painted by Mohammed Mashal, which I read about in the book, and that was the inspiration for this mural. Mohammed Mashal was an artist who was painting in Herat, and this one mural that he did was much of his life's work. He devoted a huge amount of time to this mural, and when the Taliban went into Herat, they found him and the mural, and they did whitewash it. So it's based on actual events. And as he was being dragged away, protesting from his work and from finishing this mural, he said to the Taliban who were dragging him away, he said to them, "And do the birds still sing?"
And lastly, Nick, I want to ask you whether theater can be an effective tool for kind of engaging in this kind of discourse about politics.
I think theatre can be the most effective tool because you ask people to sit down and engage. They can't just turn the page as they can with a newspaper or switch off the programme as they can with television. They're stuck there. They have to be with us for 3 lots of 2.5 hours and think about this. And it also makes people empathise and put themselves in the shoes of other people and begin to understand what it's like to be an Afghan living in the countryside in Afghanistan and having these foreign troops come in and have to deal with that on a daily basis. So all those things are useful.
Well, Nicholas, I want to thank you for your time in participating in our program, but really as an Afghan to thank you for using your curiosity to develop, a masterpiece of theater that's covering important periods of Afghan history, but also engagement with the West. I think it really is making impact on people's understanding of issues facing Afghanistan today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the program.
When we return, I'll learn how the performers of the Great Game recreated Afghanistan on the stage. I'm back at the Shakespeare Theatre in Washington, D.C.
Sheena, I want to thank you for joining us on our program.
Thank you for having me.
You play several characters in The Great Game.
I do.
The third part, which I saw your performance, which was wonderful, you played Peruk, a young girl who had been to school at one time, but then during the time of the Taliban had not been allowed to go to school.
What happened was during the time of the Taliban, it was my uncle that would actually teach me, but it would be in small dugouts or anywhere possible at night.
The secret schools that existed.
Exactly. And then in turn he was actually shot and killed quite brutally because he was found out. And this play takes place just after the Taliban have gone, and my aunt comes back to offer me an education again.
Did you do anything to research that part?
Well, it's quite difficult to find because all the research is based on news that you read. There's very little to research for the female parts because unfortunately there's not much of a voice from the women. So to research any of the female parts that I play became very difficult. To find a young Afghan girl to ask what it's like, the things that I take for granted. Education, at the age of 16 to have an education, I mean that's when I'm finishing and going on to university. So to find it was very difficult. But it was looking around as much as possible to the closest thing to it.
94, the Taliban arrived. Ara cried all night. I say, why are you crying? Now she can stay home and cook. Now she can learn from you. At least our boys can still go to school. So, okay. They go to the madrasa, they pray, they grow beard. We all look like old men. But at least my sons had an education. But Farin says, so what happens to Baruch? I say, brother, don't make trouble for yourself. He promised me.
Your brother wanted to see his niece educated.
My brother is dead.
In London, there is now a considerable Afghan diaspora population. Did you have any Afghan women there who saw the play and gave you any feedback?
We actually didn't have any Afghan women. We had a lot of Afghan men come to watch it. But again, it was very nice because the community where the theatre is based in London, there's a very large Afghan community there. So to actually speak to them and find out their opinions and you know, things like pronunciation or how to speak the language or their opinions of it helped put something else into the performance that we were giving as a representative to make sure that we didn't alter what they wanted to be seen as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background? Have you studied theater? You got interested in it? How did you come to want to portray these characters?
Well, I actually studied law. I discovered it was far too serious and decided to become an actor. And I ended up in a project called The Great Game, which is, of course, just as serious.
And what kind of support have you gotten from your family? I understand that your family originally was from India. Was it difficult for you to leave the study of law and to become an actress?
Yeah, I mean, it's for many Eastern traditions, acting and things like that is often not the most respectable profession, which is a shame because I am able to do projects like this where it does have an impact. But through this, they have been very supportive, particularly of this project. They came to see it, my family, friends, and they loved it, to see the response and the feedback and to show a different side and the reality of so much history and what we don't know and what we don't learn in the UK or anywhere else. And it's an education through this play.
In another segment of the play, going earlier back in time, you played Queen.
Yeah.
How was it playing that part?
I mean, there's lots of wonderful things to read about. The Queen of Herat, who, I mean, it's one of the very few powerful women in Afghan history, and she promoted arts and culture, so it was a lovely thing to be able to tell. It's a beautiful story to tell people about, and she's got a lovely arrogance, a very funny kind of personality, incredibly charismatic. So to play a powerful woman in a period of in Afghanistan, it's a lovely role to be able to play.
But do you think people in the West would think that in Afghan history, going back before the time of the Taliban, there would have been such strong women?
No, the problem is that there's very little awareness and education about the history. And so to have these characters shown that, you know, unfortunately we hear about women being repressed and women not doing this and so many different things that you almost neglect, well, you absolutely neglect the past and the powerful women that Afghanistan have had.
And so far, you know, you've performed here in the US a few times. What has been the reaction of American audiences, if any of them have spoken to you about what they thought of the play, and particularly your performance?
They've actually very much enjoyed it. Again, it's been an education. It's not something that is expected when you're going to the theatre. You do it on the entertainment. So it's been, the reactions have been wonderful.
But how would you encourage women in Afghanistan to think about the arts as a way that they could actually express themselves or even make a living?
It's actually why I wanted to go into acting, because it's the one medium in which you can express anything. And it's not like reading a newspaper. It's not any of those other forms, because you are able to express anything. So the arts, I wholeheartedly push and encourage, especially the women in Afghanistan, for whatever problems they have, and it's a wonderful means of expressing anything that they want to express. And now people are very, very interested in hearing about it. So absolutely make the most of it and do within whatever means you can to do it.
Sheena, I want to thank you for participating in our show.
Thank you.
More on The Great Game when we return. I'm back at the Shakespeare Theatre in Washington, D.C.
England is too big, I think. Wales, too small. There. This is Scotland at the top. I think I will split it in two and make another country. So, I will call it Durandistan. The people on this side of the line will be Scottish, the other not. Shall we call them Durandistanis? And if they protest, they'll be pacified with ink. Are there mountains in this Scotland?
The Highlands, Amir, yes.
That is inconvenient. My map would look much better without them. They are gone. They are only lines on a map, but because the pen has magic powers, no doubt the real mountains have disappeared too. As of any troublemakers who live there. There you are, Sir Mortimer. There is your map. Take good care of it. The lines on it may be imaginary, but the problems they cause only too real. You'll be fighting because of them for many years.
Rick, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's nice to be here.
I understand, you're one of the characters in this play or series of plays called The Great Game.
Yes.
What did you know about Afghanistan before you acted in this play?
I can remember the Soviet occupation being the first kind of war on television as a kid that I was aware of. That's about as much as I really knew about it. I knew that we were clearly in a conflict in Afghanistan, but my ignorance was pretty great.
So as a British citizen, you never learned about the whole Anglo-Afghan war and that history?
No, and that's pretty unforgivable because I'm a history graduate.
So do you think that maybe, is there a reason why they would not include that in the British education? Maybe they want to hide that fact that the British were
No, we're
defeated?
quite
What
good
do you
at celebrating defeats.
think? You are, okay.
Yeah. You
But-
would think I would know about it, but if I'm being honest, I didn't, and now I do.
And how has this play changed your perspective of the relationship between your country and my country?
Yeah, it's changed it forever, and in every kind of way possible.
I know that in this series you play many characters, but is there one character that you enjoy playing more?
I play about 8 characters, but we all chop and change and play lots of characters. One that I'm particularly fond of, Thomas Salter Pine was an engineer who, at the turn of the century during the Third Afghan War, was working for the Emir in Afghanistan and ended up being present at negotiations about the drawing of Duran's Line, the border between now Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Did you know Sir Mortimer Durand's influence on today's
I knew nothing
politics?
about it until I got the script.
And what do you think of what happened at that period of time and how it's impacted the politics?
Personally, it seems like a bit of a mess to me. Well, because at the time the line seemed to benefit the English as a border between Afghanistan and then what was
British.
India, British India, and now we're the wrong side of that line effectively. And the line also is very random. It's drawn in the most surreal fashion across a mountainscape that is incredibly complex, and to divide up essentially tribal land like that seems to me totally surreal.
When The Great Game played in London, did you get any reaction from the audience about that historic fact about the Durand Line and Britain's influence and what's happening today?
We got quite a lot of sort of sniggering about it, really, from the English. People are kind of appalled, I think, on some level about British imperialism. We're quite good at laughing about it now, but it's a kind of uncomfortable laughter that British audiences have about that.
We talked about some of the scenes. Is there a particular line, though, that stands out in your mind from the characters that you played?
This country is a death trap for foreign armies.
So there's that history that Afghans don't like foreign invaders, but there's also the side of the culture that they're welcoming and hospitable.
Yeah.
Did you also see that?
Yeah, it's a very difficult paradox, isn't it? There's a line by William Dalrymple. He says it's not so much hatred of the West as having foreign troops in your country ordering you about. I think that's perfectly reasonable that over a given amount of time, or over any amount of time, that becomes intolerable.
Well, Rick, thank you very much for your participation and for taking part in the play about Afghanistan.
Nice to meet you, it's a privilege.
It is our job to fight cheap wars so that our people back home can live expensive lives. There was a mistake. It has been an expensive war.
This is how he talks the whole time. Not a man in the company will listen to it.
Silence! What will happen now?
The war will become more expensive. We here in Jalalabad must be relieved. Then our enemy must be punished.
You listen to him. You listen to a drivelling fool.
Then all our soldiers must be got out, leaving the country in a worse state than we find it.
I've had enough of this. Get on your way to the gate.
What the fuck? Come on! No! God, no!
Daniel, you're one of the actors in this play called The Great Game.
Yeah.
After having been involved in this play, has your view of Western involvement in Afghanistan changed at all?
When this play came up as a possibility to do, you know, I learnt huge amounts, of course, about the detail and the history, but my opinions, my views on this sort of imperialist way of carving up the planet, which the British were you know, we talk about the Durand's line or the way in which they created Afghanistan. I mean, you just need to look at the map of Iraq or of Saudi Arabia, and you say, no natural border looks like that. That's a ruler on a piece of paper, and somebody's just gone, wallop, that's okay, we're going to do it there. It doesn't matter about the Shias, it doesn't matter about, and that's how the British do it, and have done it for years, and it's...
So do you think, you know, learning that history is helping people in the West realize some of those mistakes and to realize that it's caused some impact that we're seeing today?
Oh God, absolutely. Yeah, without doubt. And what's so sad is that we need to continually remind people of their history. It was a very wise man once said that if you don't learn from your history, you will just go on making the same mistakes over and over again. And it just seems extraordinary that we can be making these mistakes. And what was so horrendous about when we got these scripts to begin with, and you start by reading what took place in 1842, and you just go, but this is being said by the people today. I mean, what, are we insane? Are we mad? I mean, what are we doing? We've learned nothing, it seems.
I was going to ask you the question I asked of the prior actor, is that did you learn about Anglo-Afghan history in your schools in the UK?
No, I didn't. But I had a great friend who, in the 80s, had brought over a lot of late 80s, had brought over a lot of Afghan refugees to London. He helped these Afghans set up their shops there. These extraordinary fabric, and so I knew these guys through him. And what I knew about Afghan culture through him was this incredible welcome, and how Kabul was the Paris of the East. And how it was the most phenomenal place, and there was no this kind of religious fundamentalism that's taken over. It wasn't. It was about business. You know, this has been on the crossroads of the Silk Road and God knows what since you know, from time, and they will do business with anybody, and they'll welcome you. It doesn't matter whether you're Gentile, Jew. It's not a problem, and you'll be our guest, and to be the guest. And that was the Afghanistan I had heard about from my friend. So when it all just went. When the Americans went in after 9/11, and the rise of the Taliban, it was just, I just felt desperate about all that. And that's one thing when you meet Afghans, that this is not who we are, or that's not just who we are. This whole Sufi tradition, you know, just gets lost by this fundamentalist extremism, which we have here in this country too, whether that's Christian, Jewish, or, you know, whatever, Zionist. It's...
But that one small group affects
huge. It just skews the whole... And that's all, you know, that all gets forgotten. And that's interesting. I think that's something that's missing, perhaps, from our piece, is really saying, this is who they are. This is who the Afghan people are, you know.
Thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you the best in the future performances of the Great Game.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Real honor.
با تشکر از شرکت
My thanks to the Shakespeare Theatre Company, Nicholas Kent, and the performers of the Great Game.
پیشنهادات و نظریات هرچی بیشتر شما عزیزان درباره برنامه امشب پل و یا یکی از برنامه‌های قبلی پل لطفاً
You
به
can
سایت
view this or any other poll program by going to aamtv.tv or tolo.tv.
با ما به تماس شوید با امید دیدار شما
Join us next
عزیزان
week
و
for
برنامه
another
بعدی پل.
edition of
خداحافظ
Poll.
و ناصرتان.